Well, good morning in the West, good afternoon in the East, and welcome to our mid-month Public Diplomacy Forum. I'm Adam Powell, Director of Washington Programs of the USC Annenberg Center for Communication Leadership and Policy, which sponsors today's program in association with the Public Diplomacy Council and the Public Diplomacy Association of America. Jeff Cowan, Director of our center, started these mid-month programs with a mission of sharing information and exploring how we as individuals and collectively can help advance the practice, teaching, and study of public diplomacy. And this program is being recorded and is on the record. Today we welcome Vivian Walker, Executive Director of the State Department Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, and Shawn Baxter, Senior Advisor to the Commission, for a discussion of their annual report on public diplomacy and international broadcasting just released last month. So welcome Vivian and Shawn, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And Shawn to join you today. And I'm really pleased the distinguished group of mentors and colleagues and scholars and practitioners in public diplomacy who are joining us today. Shawn and I are going to talk about some of our top line challenges and recommendations, but we're really looking to you, the experts, for your comments, your feedback, and any thoughts that you might want to add to our thinking about preparing U.S. public diplomacy for 21st century challenges. So, 18 months ago or thereabouts, I appeared in front of a similar forum, then wet behind the ears executive director newly appointed to the Advisory Commission. And I was asked to talk about what I thought the future challenges were for public diplomacy and for the Commission, and what our objectives and priorities were going to be. And of course, I got one or two things right, but most of it wrong, because no one could have predicted the year that we've just had in terms of both the pandemic, obviously, but also some of the consequences, both domestic and foreign, of increased populism and nationalism and the implications for information distribution. So it's been a tumultuous year and a half. And so what we'd like to do is sort of talk about some of the challenges we see as a consequence of that, but also think about some of the recommendations that might address them. So I call this presentation a shot list, the ACPD shot list. And when I came up with that term, I was thinking about the shot list that they use in videos or films, to provide a sense of direction and preparedness for each scene for the crew. And Shawn and I see the ACPD annual report recommendations as something that are designed to provide both direction and preparedness for the U.S. public diplomacy field, for practitioners as well as scholars and policy people. These recommendations, as you know, link resources to spending, to issues, to actors, to outcomes. And these recommendations and the reporting on which they're based are unique and available nowhere else. In fact, we were very pleased to hear from a senior State Department official involved in budget and planning the following. He described the ACPD's annual report as the single most detailed and exhaustive data source available to the department, Congress, and public on how taxpayer resources support PD goals and objectives. It is far more detailed than any comparable document produced by the department itself. And Shawn and I are very proud to hear that from the department. And indeed, part of what we're going to do today, after we talk about top lines and key recommendations, is Shawn is going to spend a little time talking to you about how the report is put together. We talk about outcomes all the time, but I think it's important, especially for you, the practitioners and the scholars, to understand a little bit about process so that you understand how we ultimately arrive at the recommendations. We hope that you will find that useful as well. So to start with our challenges, and Shawn and I will go back and forth as we work our way through them. Clearly, as I said earlier, the one big challenge is the impact of the pandemic on our in-person exchange and education programs. We've got short-term tactical concerns What happens to the numerous programs that were either suspended or curtailed as a consequence of the pandemic? What happens to the current program participants? What about the timing and design of future programs? What about the host institutions at home and abroad who've either experienced enrollment declines or financial hardships or other consequences of the pandemic? How do we resurrect and rebuild those relationships? The longer term consideration with respect to the impact of the pandemic, we think, is what happens to the last 3 feet in a virtualized post-pandemic world. We clearly have benefited from the transition into virtual exchange. This conversation today is one great example. The Commission alone has been able to bring together people from multiple time zones and multiple locations to have conversations that would not otherwise be possible. So indeed, there are advantages, but we are concerned perhaps at the expense of that proverbial last 3 feet, that in-person exchange, that relationship building that is at the core of our most successful cultural and educational programs. The second big challenge area has to do with what we call variously the spread of disinformation or malign influence or authoritarian influence. I think most of you are aware of the report that we put out last September, looking at how US government, State Department and USAGM programming is responding to countering state-sponsored disinformation. But in addition to that, I think there's a sort of larger question that we need to grapple with on the strategic level. How do you use soft power tools? How do you use the public diplomacy toolkit to counter sharp power effects, particularly in the realm of information? Democratic countries don't necessarily have access to the sharp power toolkit, nor should they. And yet they are confronted with authoritarian influencers who do. So I think that will be a very interesting area for discussion. And the third big question is not one that we dealt with directly in the report, but it's one that I see emerging just in the last few months. And that is the Biden administration's focus on the American public and the need to explain how foreign policy engagement serves domestic interests. Jake Sullivan has said on a couple of instances that foreign policy is domestic policy and domestic policy is foreign policy. What are the implications of that for public diplomacy? What are the responsibilities of public diplomacy to keep the American taxpayer informed about the expenditures of blood and treasure made abroad, supposedly in their interests? And then the other aspect of that, of course, are the Smith-Mundt restrictions on domestic use of public diplomacy programs and content. As you know, they've been relaxed and indeed have become less relevant in the digital age. The spheres of home and abroad are emerging. Is it time to be thinking about developing domestic awareness of and buy-in to US foreign policy? We talk about multi-stakeholder diplomacy. What about the domestic stakeholder? And so with that, for another challenge, I'll turn it over to Shawn.
All right. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. I just want to say thank you for the invitation. And I'll just continue with sort of our big questions and overarching challenges that Vivian already started with. And one of the ones that the Commission has highlighted for a number of years, and it's really no different with the change in administrations, is the real need for sustained interagency coordination as the global information space becomes more and more complicated and complex. So, different administrations have tried different approaches to this over the years. Right now, as most of you know, the Global Engagement Center in the Department of State coordinates counter disinformation and counter propaganda efforts. And then the new, relatively new Bureau of Global Public Affairs focuses on messaging in support of department priorities and USG foreign policy priorities. But I guess the question remains is, how do these efforts with state, and particularly when you add DoD into the mix, how can these be better coordinating in terms of our outreach to foreign publics, our messaging? And Vivian just touched on the domestic aspect of this too, that eventually will have to be a part of the discussion. Should this coordinating role be assigned somewhere in the interagency to either a new body or to an entity within the White House and the National Security Council? And like I said, many attempts have been made to find a solution to this, to grapple with this problem over the years, and none of them really have been, 100% successful. So where we go with this, I think leads to an interesting dialogue. The final big challenge we highlighted in the report, and big question, is where does U.S. government public diplomacy spending go from here? We have a couple of, I think, very useful graphs in the executive summary of the report, and you can go to our website and check out the report. And one of them highlights the historical trends in PD spending over the last 20 years, basically 1980 until the present time. And you can see that PD budgets have flatlined, even declined a bit in real dollars since the mid-1990s, despite the fact that the world now has over 2 billion more people since the mid-1990s. Now, of course, we know U.S. government public diplomacy isn't designed to, nor can it reach, the entire population of the world. But much more needs to be done in terms of audience analysis and finding the right people to reach with the right content. And PD budgets haven't really matched the need for this kind of resourcing. So in the 21st century, in order to be much more effective, the Commission feels that we need to fund teams at our consulates and embassies overseas, at the regional media hubs and other locations with the necessary staff and tools to make the kind of hard strategic decisions about audiences, how to compete for their attention, how to influence them, and really how to engage people in the long term rather than just in the short term, administration to administration, or even less so, even shorter time frames in many cases. And there's a real need to do that because we have to evaluate these programs and campaigns in the field over time as well. And you can't really gain a lot of super useful information with extremely short-term campaigns and short-term evaluations. So, the US government has been facing an increasingly public global information space with much more widespread increase in extremist and foreign government propaganda. And like I said, the complexity of the media ecosystem. So the Commission is a firm believer that more resources are needed to match all of the demands that are being put on public diplomacy. And I'll shift it back to Vivian as we continue.
Great, thanks, Shawn. So now we're going to turn to some of the recommendations that were in the report. I won't go through all of them. I imagine most of you have taken a look at them, but wanted to highlight just a few of them, particularly in light of the challenges that we just outlined. So the perennial recommendation, of course, tops the list, is putting preferably a career public diplomacy officer in as an undersecretary of state, but for public diplomacy and public affairs, but most importantly, putting in an undersecretary for public diplomacy and public affairs. As Matt Armstrong pointed out in an article now written several years ago, the position has been vacant more than it has been occupied, and that is certainly true of late. And that is a real disadvantage for public diplomacy, because when you don't have an undersecretary who has a seat at the table where decisions are being made, public diplomacy inevitably becomes, if not the afterthought, but certainly not in the first order of policy consideration where it should be. So we are, and I would add that when the commissioners had an opportunity to meet with the Biden transition team, that was something that we put at the top of the list to talk about. So we hope that will come to pass. A second area of recommendations focuses on the need for strategic reviews, not only of our existing exchange and outreach programs, but also for the full range of programs offered by the U.S. Agency for Global Media. It is not that we are seeking to eliminate programs, but rather to make sure that program offerings are streamlined, that they are addressing current issues, that they are not necessarily dealing with legacy concerns, that they're not duplicating effort, that they're maximizing efficiencies and assuring the proper allocation of resources in perennially scarce resource times. Another area where we've focused our recommendations, and Shawn has already talked a little bit about that, is the need to prioritize, upgrade, and dedicate additional funding to research and evaluation efforts, not just to monitor and assess program outcomes, but also to see that the data on these assessments is shared collectively. And indeed, perhaps if we could move toward some kind of standardization of data collection, that would certainly facilitate the way in which then this data could be used. We're happy to note, actually, that in the draft state authorization, HR 1157, which is out now, that Congress has indeed taken that on board and has written into the public diplomacy legislation the need for more emphasis on research and evaluation, increasing the number of research and evaluation activities and assessments, creating a director of research and evaluation within the RPPR, the policy shop in R, and biennial reporting to the ACPD on department research and evaluation efforts, and increased training of research and evaluation at FSI. So assuming that, in fact, this draft authorization comes to pass, there will be significant focus on research evaluation mandated by Congress. And again, we're happy to see that. Another recommendation that we've posted consistently over the last few years is the provision of limited legislative exemptions to the Privacy Act of 1974 and the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1995. Basically, there are, and understandably so, a number of review processes that are in place when, Department of State or other agencies want to collect data on audiences for analytical purposes. And we understand why these review processes are necessary, but at the same time, and particularly in the realm of public diplomacy, when we count on an ability to be flexible and responsive, and when there's a problem, we want to be able to assess it and understand the audiences who are affected by this by the issue, maybe the source of the issue. And so easing restrictions on the ease in which and the rapidity in which this data can be collected are very important. And we were also then happy to note that in the draft legislation, HR 1157, Congress also wrote that in, providing long-sought limited exceptions to the Paperwork Reduction Act. So we'll see if that comes to pass, but that's certainly something that's very important. And finally, I'll just close out my portion of the recommendations discussion, talking briefly about USAGM, the U.S. Agency for Global Media. You certainly saw, I hope, one of our top line recommendations was, of course, to end the effort to politicize the agency's journalists and repair the breaches to the congressionally required firewall. And we're happy to say, as you all know, that a number of important steps have already been taken in that direction. But I would add to that this is something that still needs to be watched carefully. And the second set of recommendations for USAGM that came about as a consequence in part of actions of the previous administration is something that didn't get the same kind of airplay as the firewall issue, but we think is equally important. And that is that USAGM lost congressionally approved and allocated funding for grantees and networks and federal offices for news programming, research and technology, incubation and development, and particularly funding related to dealing with authoritarian influence. And so I think it's very important that this funding be restored to USAGM so that they can continue to make sure that that the US government remains competitive in the global information space. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Shawn.
All right. To continue with sort of the highlights of our recommendations, the next one that we want to talk about a little bit, because it's really important what's happening in the Office of the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, is what they're doing to modernize the practice of public diplomacy for officers and for locally employed staff in the field. And this is it's kind of a three-legged stool. It's providing new tools through this initiative that they're calling PD Modernization, and that's the PD tools suite of software, and also a new contact relationship management system, which is already, in its initial phase, its initial pilot has been getting raves. So we're really interested to see how these how these can make the practice of public diplomacy easier for our officers in the field. Because one of the things we hear about over and over and over again from colleagues in the field is how stretched for time, especially our American officers are in the field, and how overtaxed they are in terms of all the things they have to manage in addition to getting the message out, running the programs, and tying everything to foreign policy. So these tools are going to be important going forward. We're really looking forward to, assessing their impact. Hopefully they meet the goals that have been set for them. Another aspect of this, sort of the second leg of this PD modernization effort, is what's happening with our staff overseas, the realignment of staff, and this is called the PD Staffing Initiative. So the commission, again, is very interested in this. We've been in discussions with Ripper about how this is going. It's still very much an interim, or it's still very much a process that's in its first phase. I think at last count, about 44 posts have fully implemented the new staffing paradigm. And really what this is designed to do is to prioritize audience engagement and analysis, and tie audiences much more directly to our foreign policy goals, and to do that by improving content creation, bringing the content that's really going to have an impact on the right audiences, and bringing the staff basically from a model that is really fixated presently on functions, to one that is much more tied to impact. And so we're going to be looking at this closely, the commission, over the next 6 to 9 months, and in a sort of an interim assessment. And we also hope that Ripper is in a continual education mode on this, in terms of keeping the field, keeping public diplomacy officers aware of how this is changing PD, because this is really quite a revolutionary change in how our offices overseas, how PD offices overseas are staffed. And then finally, we're working with FSI. Well, we're not working with FSI, but we're monitoring what FSI is doing in terms of the PD training, because all of this has a training component. You can't just launch these new systems like PD tools and the contact relationship management system. You can't set up a new staffing paradigm if you're not training people and bringing them up to speed, because otherwise you're just setting them up for failure. So this is going to be very important going forward, FSI's contribution to this effort. And then the last major recommendation I want to highlight from the 2020 report is our recommendation to make the Global Engagement Center a fully fledged bureau. When it was founded in 2011, I believe, I'd have to go back and look at the date, but I think that's right. It was the CSCC, the Center for, I'm blanking all of a sudden on the name, but it was really founded more to counter violent extremism. And that mission has changed over the years to also counter disinformation, to counter foreign propaganda. It's also grown exponentially from having a budget of 5 million to now well over $60 million and going from a few dozen employees to approaching 150 employees. So really in terms of continued oversight of its activities, and in terms of being forthright about its position within the department, it really deserves to be its own bureau at this point. Now, I want to transition next to sort of the sausage making, if you will. We want to talk to you a little bit about how we produce the report. It's now in its 7th iteration, so and I feel like it's gained more and more credibility over the years, more and more interest, and really it has, I would say, an 11 to 12-month life cycle. It's not something that we put together in a quarter. It takes quite a lot of time. And most of that is because of the outreach that we do with the individual bureaus in the Department of State and also USAGM, and the data collection and analysis that we do once we have the contributions from the bureaus. So we're just finishing up sort of the end of the life cycle for the 2020 report now. Our public meeting that was held last month, and this meeting, and a couple of others will pretty much tie that up. And then we are already talking about how next year's report might be a little bit different. You know, we have a section in the reports called Spotlights, and we, want to keep those germane to what's happening in the world right now. So, one of the things we know that 2020 focused on was COVID, on how PD was done. So we're going to take a close look at that, potentially for the 2021 report, for example. So we're looking internally about how, this is the time of the year when we look about how we want to make changes to the report. Very soon, we'll be reaching out to the bureaus for their input on their 2020 programs, because even though the next report, we titled it the 2021 report, the reports look at the most recent fiscal year of information. So for the and we'll be gathering program input, budget data, strategy information that can be shared in terms of how the bureaus steered their public diplomacy programs, and the U.S. foreign policies that the PD program supported. So all of that, our outreach with the bureaus and the input from the bureaus will continue through the early summer, and we will be doing our drafting and redrafting and editing starting midsummer, collecting visuals. It's a pretty big process, and I think we've realized over the last couple iterations of this process, just to pat ourselves on the back a bit, that doing it with 2.5 people, because our third employee is a half-time program assistant, and she is wonderful. She's a huge contributor to the process, but doing it all with 2.5 people, we feel is pretty impressive. And then in September, October, we complete the edits, we reconcile the budget data, finalize the charts, tables, finalize our recommendations. We do preview the recommendations as a courtesy with the bureaus, especially with the main PD bureaus at the Department of State and USAGM, but we don't clear our recommendations with them because the ACPD is an independent federal advisory commission. So we don't need department clearance in terms of what is published. And then we, of course, obtain commissioner approval, and we publish. The aim is to publish at the end of each calendar year. And sometimes there are reasons, sometimes technical reasons where we need to push that back a bit, but that's the goal each year. And so happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but we just wanted to lay out our process a little bit for you so that you understand how it's all put together. So thank you.
Well, I think we should recognize that we are joined by the chairman of the Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. So welcome, Mr. Chairman. We have been distributing, there he is, his camera's on. He's the one with the American flag behind him. Good day, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me on, Adam, to say hello. And Vivian and Shawn, I just want to say you guys are doing an incredible job and very informative, very professional. And I'm very, very pleased to have you people working with myself. I think Bill Hibble, our vice chairman, is on here also. And maybe he wants to say hello also because he's much more articulate than I am and better looking.
None of the above, Sim. It's a pleasure to be on today, and I just want to thank everyone for the presentation. Certainly, Vivian and Shawn.
Thank you very much. And I know that Judy Kang has distributed through chat directions for those of you who need it on how to raise your hand electronically. I see 3 hands. I've seen 3 hands so far: Mike Anderson, Debbie Trent, and Mark Rebstock. So why don't we begin with Michael Anderson?
Let me commend the commission and Vivian and Shawn for absolutely a super report. I just found it absolutely stunning. It's very comprehensive, very readable, and would be of interest and useful to a lot of different audiences. Prospective Foreign Service officers, PD people in the field need to know what's going on, and certainly Congress and the general public. So thank you for putting what must have been thousands of hours into pulling that data together and simplifying it and packaging it into a very lengthy but comprehensive report. So thank you. And I look forward to the new edition next year. Now, my question is this. When USIA was consolidated into the State Department, there was a big issue made about firewalling or protecting the PD budget. The fear was that once state took over USIA, it would grab PD resources. I've asked a few people, whatever happened to that policy of firewalling the PD money? And to my utter shock, I have gotten very different answers. Some people say, oh, that still continues. Others say, no, that was wiped out or eliminated by Congress several years ago, or it just went away, or it's no longer an issue. It was only a temporary measure. I would urge the commission to grapple with this issue and clarify it. Are PD budgets currently in State Department protected? You know, whether it's the Fulbright program or the representation money or PD slots, is that protected, or has that congressional mandate, congressional protection gone away? So I just raise that as a concern that is still out there and is very confusing because people I respect have different answers to it. So we need to get to the bottom of it so everybody understands the nature of the PD budget. Thank you.
Thanks. So I don't have a definitive answer for you. My sense was that there are certain protections still in place because we continue to have money allocated very specifically for public diplomacy, but I don't know what happened to the evolution, whether this is a further iteration of the firewalls that were, or whether this is something else. So this is a question that we will take on board, but I also, please, we have a lot of expertise in the audience today, folks who know perhaps even more about this than we do. So please, anyone jump in if you've got a response for Michael.
Debbie Trent said she was applauding, not raising her hand. So the next hand I saw was Mark Rebstock.
I was also applauding, not raising my hand, but now I have a question, so I will take the opportunity. I wondered, Vivian, I was sort of going back to your point about this past year, and particularly as an exchange practitioner working at Meridian International Center, I'm interested in your thoughts on how in-person exchanges are going to resume in the big picture. And I'm also interested, in light of the report that was covered in the Hill last week by Ambassadors Dobryansky, Gabriel, and Lino. Great sort of summary of the impact of in-person exchanges. We've certainly learned a lot about virtual exchanges in the past year, and I think it will be fascinating to see how exchange programs come out on the other side of this pandemic pause, strengthened and better and improved as a result. And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on how we lay the groundwork to make sure that that vision is a reality.
Thank you, Mark. That's a great question. I don't have an answer in terms of what is going to happen to in-person exchanges. I don't think anybody knows, except that we do know that there are certainly going to be consequences. What we do have to do, however, and perhaps you and everyone here today can help us with this, I think it's important to identify the right questions to ask. What are the pressure points? What should we be looking for? Is it restoring, what happened, are there participant related questions? Are there host institution related questions? I think we have to identify the vulnerabilities and then come up with a set of questions to ask about how we address them. And that needs to be done sooner rather than later. And we do have that on our radar. But again, we welcome anyone's input on that. In terms of the strategy report that you mentioned, authored by Ambassadors Dobryansky, Lino, and a couple of others. Yes, that report did an excellent job of highlighting ECA's impact and certainly reinforced our general understanding that exchange programs, cultural exchange programs, educational exchange programs make an enormous difference. The impetus for that report came in part from an ACPT recommendation longstanding over a few years about the need to engage in strategic review of programs, of ECA's programs. And this report did a great job in certainly talking about the strategic impact. But we still see the need, as I mentioned earlier, in looking at reviewing the programs themselves, all 90 plus programs, and thinking about, do they all, each of these 90 programs individually still make sense? Are there ways where we can consolidate some? Are there new areas that we need to be exploring? So I think as a follow-on to that excellent review of ECA impact is now a need to look at the existing programs and try to rationalize them. So anything, Shawn, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would just add, just going back to the sort of the impact of COVID that we first were talking about, I think, looking back to our public meeting last month, and I don't know how many of you were able to catch that, but we had a really interesting discussion in that session, really led by Jay Wang, who was talking a lot about where to exchange. Where does the last 3 feet sort of end up in this post-pandemic world? And I thought he was particularly insightful in terms of talking about this intersection that's happening between the physical and the digital. He had a name for it, phygital. But he was talking about how there's a sweet spot, how people in the future are going to be looking for. It's not good enough to go 100% digital because you lose that human contact that way, but it's also not realistic to be reaching all the audiences we want to reach in the future physically. So there's this sweet spot that exists between dividing up in terms of dividing up these programs in a way where you can reach more people through the digital sphere, but also having, a few days or a couple of weeks, if they're longer programs, of having some physical human contact, so you give an opportunity for people to meet face to face. And I thought that was very insightful. It's going to be really interesting, and we're going to be tracking this in terms of how programs evolve in that way. And I'm sure a lot of you have thoughts on that and are going to be looking at it in the future as well. And
you might see how that's being done in different fields. We find that, For example, at USC in the medical school, they've been able to increase the number of outpatients by a factor of 20, and the School of Social Work has increased the number of families they're reaching by, I think, a factor of 1,000. It's with this hybrid of in-person and electronic. So it's something which many fields are going to be struggling with, but public diplomacy very important. I see 3 hands: Greta Morris, Mary Walker, and Bruce Gregory. So Ambassador Morris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vivian and Shawn, for really, really interesting report and your excellent summary of it today. I had 2 questions. We're talking about the domestic role of public diplomacy, and of course the Bureau of Global Public Affairs to both a global audience but also a domestic audience. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts beyond that. And then my second question, you started out talking about the need to coordinate and unify the policy message for both the American public and the global audience among all of the various departments and agencies in Washington. And where should this function be housed, in which department, which agency, a combination of more than one? And I'm just wondering if you have a recommendation for where that would be most appropriately housed. And I'd be very interested in your recommendation.
Thank you. Excellent questions. So starting with, you're absolutely right with respect to GPA and a domestic focus. The GPA mission statement, which I think we discussed at a quarterly meeting, like one of our first quarterly meetings. My first one as executive director, we invited the then leadership of GPA to talk about the formation of the bureau. And there's clear that it's an increased domestic focus, but it's more than that. There is, as I mentioned, a real groundswell of interest in extending it beyond simply messaging in reach. I commend to you the Truman Center report. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on a State Department reform, but it has a number of interesting suggestions about how the Department of State should be more engaged domestically. Frankly, and I know we're on the record, but speaking off the record, I was a little disappointed that the one piece that they seemed to allocate to public diplomacy specifically was something about the creation of an Office of Entertainment Management, something like that. Don't quote me. I don't have it quite right, but it was something about entertainment. And yet a number of other things that they suggested that the department could do, I thought could in fact be centered with public diplomacy. So I think there's, so take a look at that Truman Center report. They talked certainly about increased liaison with Congress and the American people. They talked about building up virtual networks that would connect domestic and foreign audiences. They talked about formalizing university engagement and partnerships, something very familiar to those of us from USIA days, the University Partnership Program. They talked about expanding that. And what they didn't talk about, but is something that we, those of us who are public diplomacy practitioners, know very well, what are international visitor programs? What is the work of organizations like the Meridian Center? But domestic public diplomacy, because the folks who come over as international visitors or students or scholars, they do a wonderful job of sort of explaining the foreign context domestically. So I think there are things that are in place already that can be amplified, and there are a number of interesting initiatives out there in addition to what the GPA is doing. So take a look at the Truman Center report if you haven't already. In terms of policy messaging coordination, I don't. I have to agree, I think, with Martha, who I'm blanking, Martha Bales. Martha Bales also participated in our panel a few weeks ago when we rolled out the report. And she was talking about USAGM and more about authoritarian influence, but she made the point that, to have one controlling, consolidating authority for messaging is probably not a good idea. That has perhaps more authoritarian than democratic overtones. So I don't think certainly overarching consolidating authority is where we want to go. I am of the mind that each agency needs to have a clearly defined sort of coordinating authority within the institution, and the capacity to work across the interagency when necessary to address issues of messaging or coordination in the information space when it is an issue that involves national security. But that this cooperative, this collective is pulled together when needed. Because if you try to keep that kind of collective going week after week to meet with one another, it will die. But if you have them all positioned and in place when we do need to really think hard about how we're going to be messaging something externally, then that capacity is there. But there are many schools of thought on this. So Shawn, if you want to add, or in fact, anyone else out in the audience, I know there are people present today who have very interesting ideas on this issue, and I'd love to hear from you.
I think the only thing I'd add is that, speaking from relatively recent field experience, I think some of this works quite well in the field. Mm-hmm. As a PAO at one of our constituent posts in Italy, I was in weekly contact with the various military PAOs at our bases in Italy on certain things. And I think that the players know each other in the field, and that can work. But I think where it sometimes breaks down is when DOD is talking about something from one angle and state is talking about it from another angle in Washington, and they haven't really checked in with each other well enough on some of that. And so I think that's amplified when you start talking about one of the big goals in the new interim national security guidance is that we're going to outcompete China, for example. Well, to me, that really cries out for a very well integrated, very well coordinated messaging and even programmatic campaign that's going to tie in multiple agencies across the U.S. government over a sustained period of time. And so, to me, it's going to be very interesting to see how we decide to grapple with that as a whole of government. And I'm sure there's going to be other initiatives like that as well in the future.
Thank you both very much. Yeah, I would agree that integration and coordination of message when it's necessary is very important, not necessarily control. So thank you. That was a very helpful clarification.
And I see Mary Walker, Bruce Gregory, and Tom Kent. So Mary Walker.
Thank you. And some of you may know me as Karen Walker, but I wanted to offer, in terms of the interagency coordination and whole of society, a model that I became familiar with working at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and that is the functional management model, where you would have an individual in a functional management role for public diplomacy or strategic communications who would oversee the interagency community. And the advantage of taking the model of the functional manager for geospatial intelligence, that individual would have responsibility for overseeing the government activities for PD, STRATCOM, in terms of interoperability. So as you're working through the data infrastructure and the contact management and those types of tools, the professionalization, so leveraging FSI, but ensuring that other officers, whether they be in commerce or treasury or Homeland Security, wherever they may reside, would also be working on the same curriculum and toward the same goals, inspiring new talent, unity of effort, and most important, creating a basic doctrine for that functional management area. So raising it out of a single agency silo and looking at it from that professional perspective, right, rather than agency mandate, but as a PD professional, but working in that cross-government setting, purposes, means, authorities, working through those types of issues, and also being the final arbiter and decision maker on prioritizing resources, marshaling resources, and being that single voice on PD for the US government, and kind of giving a space and final decision where you have those debates between state and defense and so on. And the last point is that I like this model because it did give the functional manager an entree to do whole of society, working with the private sector, working with academia, working with diasporans, working with NGOs, civil society, and a mandate that was very clear and on behalf of all government agencies. So rather than state going to the private sector and Homeland going to private sector and DoD going to private sector, you had one functional manager who was going to those entities on behalf of the government. So just something I think might work. The one downside is that in the IC, the functional manager also is dual-hatted, which is not a good model. It really creates some internal conflicts. But having an individual sort of as the functional model, functional manager independent of the agency heads, I think would make some sense.
Yeah, great. I'm going to look it up. Or perhaps you could, if you've got something on it that I could read, I would love to see it. But thank you. It's great.
Bruce Gregory.
Thanks to Vivian and Shawn for your presentation, and kudos on the report. A couple of questions, but first, in response to Michael Anderson's earlier comments, at the last first Monday that Michael McCary moderated with two former senior Senate appropriations staffers, I raised this question. And I think their answer went along the lines that only 3 people in Washington remember that firewall, and there was no clear answer. So I'd like to double down on his suggestion that we find out what happened to firewalls there were separate firewalls for ECA and for the diplomatic and consular programs budget. 2 quick questions. I'd like to hear more about the new post-staffing paradigm. What's behind it? How is it structured? How widespread is it? And where is it going? And secondly, you raised having met with the transition team. Is there anything more you can share with us about that meeting? Who did you meet with? And where are they going with public diplomacy? Thanks.
Great. Well, I'll let Shawn take the first question since he's putting together our report, our interim report on the issue.
Sure. So the staffing initiative, I mean, it's been around for quite a while, the notion of it. it was basically brought up for the first time in 2011. So it's actually, the idea of doing this is about 10 years old, but it took a long time to get any legs because there was no funding for it, of course, no staff to dedicate to it. And just within the last couple of years, it's been properly resourced. And so now there's a team within our PPR that is doing this full time. Of course, COVID really set them back because the coaching, the training teams that were going out into the field to do these with posts, they could not do that physically anymore. So everything had to transition, as with everything else over the past year, to how we're meeting now. And so they continued to do this. I think it slowed down for several months, but now it's back up to steam. My understanding, as of a couple of weeks ago, about 40 posts had completed the process of going from the old staffing model to the new staffing model. And there are, there's a whole series of sort of templates that exist for new position descriptions, moving people into a much more, the goal is to move the staff into a much more collaborative association with one another, rather than just having people siloed off doing their own thing, whether it's culture, whether it's press. Now you have people that are doing both. Really, the goal is to have all staff be able to do these things, not only to back each other up, but because PD is really, it's a multi-tooled endeavor now. And the staff, the goal is to bring the human resources much closer to the audiences in terms of analysis and understanding who we need to reach. And so that's what the goal is, to increase the impact of how we're staffed overseas. And this started with really looking at local staff. I mean, that by far, that is the majority of public diplomacy staff that exists worldwide is locally employed staff. But now they're starting to understand that there will be an American component to this as well, because American staff in the field is also very segmented in terms of information officers, cultural affairs officers. And so there's the next phase of this, after sort of a tipping point is reached with the locally engaged staff, is to start looking at how our position descriptions and how we categorize the work that public diplomacy officers, American officers, are doing overseas. The next logical question is, how does this impact how we're staffed domestically? And I think that is something that is just beginning to be thought about, because of course, if you're changing the whole overseas staffing model, how is that going to impact how we're reaching out to the field from Washington? So I don't know if that helps. It's still rather general, but there's a whole lot of specificity in this, and you can really dig into it. And that's actually what I'm going to be doing over the next several months. I'm transitioning to this as my swan song with the commission, because I have about 6 months left in the position, so before I rotate. So I'm going to be looking very closely at this, and it's a really interesting project.
Thanks, Shawn. And I would just add that it's a Kuhnian paradigm shift. I mean, if this really comes to pass, I mean, really moving away from the concept of cultural and information, but rather transforming into the degree and level and quality of audience engagement. So as Shawn says, it's and how it plays out in post to post is very specific to each post. That's another thing that we're starting to see as well. So we're trying to produce an interim report that will provide a snapshot of what's going on. But it's definitely something that my successor and my successor's successor will have to continue to look at, because I think ultimately it will be transformative for the practice of public diplomacy, both at home and abroad. And your second question was with respect to the transition team. And there are no secrets in what we told the transition team. We basically told them everything we just told you in terms of our top line recommendations, starting with the undersecretary. We pushed hard on something that the Blinken State Department already fixed right away, and that is the restoration of daily in-person press briefings. We found that to be a tremendous deficit, making the United States non-competitive in the global information space when it came to regular articulations of policy positions. And as you know, that happened very quickly. I won't say it happened because of our recommendations, but I think they heard it from other quarters, but certainly that was at the top of our list. They were quite interested in USAGM. And of course, there was a whole separate team dedicated, as you know, to those issues. But we provided our input, and our input was consistent with, again, what we just described in our recommendations. So no surprises there. They seemed receptive. They were polite, and that's about all I can report on that. I don't know if Sim was there with me. I don't see him anymore. Okay, so he doesn't have anything to add to that. So, okay, thanks.
Tom Kent, I think you have the last question.
Hey, hi, Vivian, and nice to meet you, Shawn. I'd like to ask a question about the Global Engagement Center. I think the Global Engagement Center does a lot of very good things. I'm a fan. But at the same time, I'm aware of those within state and embassies and the interagency that consider it rather a lightweight organization. Not my word. That they feel that when they go to it for help or planning or something like that, that it can't deliver from other bureaus in state. It can't deliver from embassies. It can't deliver from other agencies, even though congressionally mandated, its congressional mandate is to coordinate all agencies across the government. So, people, some people in the interagency tend to ignore it. They just go and they'll deal with the regional bureau, they'll deal with the embassy, and it's not quite. There's no payoff to them to dealing intensely with GEC except what's required by politeness. So I see that your recommendation is that the GEC be elevated to a bureau status. Will that address these issues, or do you think that I'm overinflating the issues here, and the GEC really is leading the cross-governmental charge in a way that maybe I can't perceive?
Well, a couple of things. We've heard similar criticisms at home and in the field. We've also heard some very positive reports on the work that GEC has been able to do, particularly in their unique ability really to partner with host countries, governments, and institutions, and their partnerships with private sector. What we've heard in the field and what we've seen is that often that ability to work with private sector, with other institutional entities, their ability to sort of reach out and tap smart thinking, both in the public and private sector, and put that to good work, that has produced a lot of great results. So I think, we've heard both. We've heard the criticisms that you've identified, but we've also heard some very positive stories that are unique to GEC's mandate, that ability to work with both public and private sectors, and that unique flexibility that we don't quite have, strictly speaking, working within public diplomacy. In terms of elevating it to the level of an institution, the thought is that, of a bureau, the thought there is that by creating, they have a huge mission, but they really don't have the infrastructure and the resources to carry it out. Again, speaking on the record, off the record, the mission to coordinate all of these activities across government is a challenging one, and I don't think that any entity is capable of doing that effectively. But to give GEC a fighting chance to, I think they need to have the infrastructure and the resources to match the mission. Now, if they have all of that, and then they still fail to achieve some of these objectives in their mandate, then we can have a conversation about their failures. But I think they need to be given the opportunity to step up. And we think that the bureau status might be one way to do it. Shawn, do you want to add to that?
I think the only thing I'd add is that, I heard over the years, especially as a practitioner in the field, that there were some pretty significant internal communication and cultural divisions within GEC as well, just based on its initial staffing model, because they take detailees from DoD, from the intelligence community, from state, and so you put all those people together into a mix where the mission maybe wasn't 100% ironed out, and I think it became quite difficult for some folks to work together to achieve the goals. That's my own feeling, and that based on input that I've received over the years. They were a great partner for the commission in terms of helping devise a survey that we used in our special report that was published last year on disinformation. And we anticipate hopefully working with them again in the future on some other projects. So I think also it's only really been since 2017, since the NDAA of 2017, that they've really been properly resourced and staffed. And so if you think about it, that's really only been a couple of fiscal years. And I think I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to see a much better organized and oriented organization going forward. But I would agree with what Vivian said in terms of elevating it to a bureau.
All right, thanks to our speakers, Vivian Walker, Executive Director of the State Department Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, and Shawn Baxter, Senior Advisor to the Commission. Thanks for a fascinating conversation. Our next program on Monday, April 5th at 12 noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific time, will be a global conversation on hip-hop diplomacy, on how the U.S. uses hip-hop music and culture for public diplomacy. Until then, thank you for coming, and we're adjourned.